And I have to tell you, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's lunch speaker, Peter Diamond. Sil, you all know Peter is an exceptional scholar. In graduate school, we had to read, we had the opportunity to read. His work with Jim Murley's in our public finances courses. Labor types read his work on search and their labor courses, and we're all familiar with his extensive writings in the area of pensions and Social Security, looking not only at the U.S. systems, but more recently internationally with Nick Barr. But the wonderful thing about Peter is really not his intellectual accomplishments, but the man himself. And I think his resume says it all. I don't know if you've ever looked at Peter's resume, but it starts with the fact that he's married and has 2 children. And any of you who have ever tried to arrange anything with Peter knows that the things have to work around his family's schedule. There is no flexibility there. There's flexibility on every other front, but not on that front. And then in earlier days, if you were arranging calls with Peter in the summer, you'd have to also come after he had finished windsurfing on the lake. So family life is very important to him. It's also, if you're looking at this resume, it's very hard to find that Nobel thing. It is buried between the Bob Ball Award and an honorary membership in the Turkish Science Academy. If I had a Nobel Prize, I'd have it say, Alicia Manel, Nobel Prize winner, in big, bold letters at the top. Finally, Peter's CV lists his professional activities. The list confirms what I have always known, that Peter is willing to help on any panel, any working group, any commission, if he's interested in the topic. And his interests are really broad. And I've taken advantage of that willingness more than once, most recently on the 215 technical panel. So I'm truly delighted, but not surprised, that Peter has taken the time to be with us today to share his most recent thinking on Social Security reform. So please join me in welcoming Peter Diamond.
It's bad form to start by correcting what your introducer said. But the windsurfing was off Cape Cod, and windsurfing on the lake, where I have a summer house now, is so bad that I've given it up. Age might have had something to do with that, too. My talk now is focused on political economy with a touch on identifying some policy issues that need more research. Oh, there we go, okay. This picture everyone is familiar with. I was a bit annoyed to have to track down a 2017 number because it came out so recently. I was all set with 2016. And the real question this raises, we've got until that sharp drop in everybody's benefits to get some legislation if we're going to avoid it. And so the questions are, when might we get some legislation, and what sort of legislation might come out of the process? And so what I'm going to do in the talk is review the past history of 2 successes in getting legislation, whatever you think of the legislation. We got legislation. And 3 failures of presidents who were eager to get legislation, but didn't succeed in doing it. So that's the outline of the political economy. Along the way, I will touch on the 3 issues listed there. The use of debt by Social Security, that did actually happen in terms of legislation allowing it for the period 83 to 86, but small scale and just borrowing from other trust funds. There's an ongoing debate about the determinant of the cost of living adjustment, and then there's not much of a debate, except Alicia has put it very much prominently in front, of whether the trust fund should invest in stocks. So let's start back. Everybody, I'm sure, knows 1972, and an over-indexed Social Security system was put in place. The then chief actuary, testifying before the Senate Finance Committee, was asked whether the indexing was done correctly, and he said no. The Office of the Actuary was well aware of that, but he said at the rates of inflation the U.S. has historically had, this did not matter for long-run sustainability. 1972 was not a good time to rely on continuing low inflation. And so the system blew up, as you can see from those figures. The actuarial balance was rising rapidly and got big, and the date of trust fund hitting zero started closing in. So there was a focus at that point in getting legislation, and 77 legislation. The trustees report the year after they had gone down from 820 to 140. They knew they hadn't reached actuarial balance, but given the size of the problem, that was a big step in the right direction. What about the short run? Well, the baby boomers were coming into the labor force. That looked very promising for Social Security. So the feeling was the near term is going to be just fine, and then we'll be okay for a while, and then down the road there will be a problem. Again, the economy didn't live up to that billing, so this from the 1982 trustees report saw a problem that they were not going to be able to avoid that cliff where Social Security would have to cut everybody's benefits when the trust fund hit zero. But the problem, as they saw it, was primarily a short-run problem, although they recognized as well that there was a long-term problem. So the commission met and began by saying what the state of the problem is. That's important to get a consensus. This is what we're trying to fix. That was part of the earlier problem. My initiation into the Social Security world was when I served on a panel in 1974, confirming for Senate Finance that the Office of the Actuary was right, that we really, really had a problem. And I've been involved on and off ever since, although I mostly stopped about a decade ago until Alicia asked me to do something today. The Greenspan Commission came out with a set of short-run solutions that was signed off on by 12 out of the 15 members. And that was basically what got passed by Congress. The short-run solution from the Commission became law. But for the long run, the Commission split quite widely. I've split them by who appointed them rather than what party they were in, because the president picked some very conservative Democrats as part of his appointment. And as you can see, one side went not just doing everything by lowering benefits, but throwing in Medicare for good measure at the same time. And the other side did everything through additional finances and tapping into general revenues. So there was a big split. And that then went to Congress, and the decision was made to proceed by having a bill put up by Ways and Means, a bill designed by the Social Security Subcommittee of Ways and Means, that would then be the basis for two possible amendments. Rules Committee would set this rule. First Amendment would come up. It would pass, or, well, the expectation was the bill itself would pass first. Amendment would come up. It would replace something or not. Second Amendment would come up, and it would either be battling again with the bill or the other amendment. And here are the two proposed amendments. One of them was doing everything around the age for full benefits. The other was doing everything around an increase in tax rates. Both of them were doing it way off in the future. And then came the votes. As you can see, the Republicans were close to unanimous what they liked and what they didn't like, and the Democrats were a bit all over the place on these things. So, of course, as you all know, we got the increase in the age for full benefits. Now, if you then looked at the actual legislation, the two parts of it, you see the short-term solution, which was following what came out of the commission, was close to 50-50. There are different ways of doing the scoring. Long-term looked very different. Part of that was that the age of full benefits was chosen as the solution. And that was about a third of the overall whole. But the other part was a split in the different measures between things that were adding to revenues or decreasing benefits on an ongoing basis and things that were only temporary. And the temporary element was this one, that the already legislated increases in the payroll tax rate were moved earlier in time, which had an impact on the short-run finances, but there were no change in the long-run payroll tax rate. So from the beginning of Social Security until 1990, Social Security had a future tax rate increase that had been legislated. Some of them were delayed. As far as I know, none of them were ever canceled. Lots of speeches about, we'll see that this doesn't happen, and then you go to Congress and it happens. But so this was a big break, and that's the big reason for the difference between the two. And just to say what I'm sure everybody in this room knows, changing the age for full benefits, or what was then called the normal retirement age, I was doing cut and paste on these slides, means whatever age you retire, you get a smaller benefit. And that's the picture shown there. It's not a uniform 20% or what have you across the board. It's a little bit different percentages at different places. In fact, if you look at that, it hits the 62-year-olds a lot harder than it hits the 70-year-olds, which would be an odd choice to make if you think of income levels and life expectancies of people retiring at those two ages. So I started responding to Alicia's request. You know what a request means from Alicia. I started working on that, assuming, okay, this worked in 83, and what'll happen is we'll go up to the last minute, and then we'll have a commission, and the commission will come up with something, and it will happen. And then I started reading, which I hadn't done earlier on, some of the political history, and particularly this very slim volume by the late Bob Ball. What really happened in his book is that the commission was incapable of coming to an agreement that would get the required number of votes to go forward. And the two principals, President Reagan, Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, stepped in, and each appointed a spokesperson to speak for them, and they gathered a small group. They met secretly. There are some amusing stories of Bob Ball trying to hide from the press. And they came up with a solution, which they then had to sell to the commission. So Bob Ball's description is this is a reversal. The point of a commission is to come up with a solution for the principals. The principals came up with a solution that they then succeeded in selling to the commission, and that's how we got the legislation. I think there are two lessons from this. One is it will make a big difference if we have leaders in the two parties who can deliver the votes in the two parties. And secondly, I come away with a sense the commission was very helpful anyway. I'm skeptical that the two of them could have just worked it out by themselves and brought along the parties. So looking forward, I think a commission's a good idea, but it's not going to be the whole story. So let's look forward. This is the 75-year actuarial deficits faced year by year from doing something now to later, and I thank the BC Center on Retirement Research for helping to crank the numbers for me. And as you see, unlike the run-up to 77, it doesn't rise rapidly, it rises smoothly. Unlike 77, it's not as big a problem. So I think the kinds of pressures that led to legislation before the last minute in 77, I don't think it will be there. If we look at the picture I've shown you already, that there was really only a temporary and shrinking problem to deal with back in '83, and you look again at the annual figures going ahead, the problem gets a lot larger, stays larger, and doesn't disappear because there isn't another set of baby boomers to come in. So I come away with the expectation, which will perhaps be reinforced by looking at the three failures, that we are in for a wait till the end. So let's take a look at those three failures, or some pieces of them. The Advisory Council, 94 to 96, President Clinton was very active, trying to convince the public there was a need to do something. And the Advisory Council split into three groups. Ned Gramlich came up with the idea of an add-on payroll tax increase for individual accounts, in a sense doing something that each party liked. The large group that wanted individual accounts as a replacement wanted to move 5 points of the payroll tax into financing individual accounts. That, of course, creates a sizable cash flow problem, which they propose to address in two steps. A temporary increase in the payroll tax for only 72 years. And that wasn't enough because the time shape of the loss of revenue and the gain from reduced benefits were very different, borrowing from the Treasury to be repaid. The third group I'll get back to later. So jump ahead, President Bush, he appointed a commission to design an individual account system. He definitely pushed hard on that, and what came out of that? Temporary transfers from general revenue for, this case, what's that, 29 years of borrowing, and again, to be paid back. So what else was going on while the President's Commission was there? This is a chart from some long ago PowerPoint talks. There were a whole bunch of proposals, and every single one with individual accounts had some degree of borrowing from the Treasury, and this is how much relative to GDP there would have been outstanding in 2050. The one that wins the prize is Sununu and Ryan. We know Ryan's attitude toward building up the debt. So this was there, and we also know in these there's a strong tendency to not, at least not visibly, reduce benefits for the already retired. President Bush instructed the commission not to reduce benefits for anyone over 55. And when it comes to raising taxes, raising them suddenly would be a shock to the economy in large scale. So some people have thought, wait till the end, you can do more on the tax side than the benefit side given the political leverage, and that will lean it. I think that view is misguided because I think the pressure to borrow from the Treasury will be irresistible. The fact that we've never done it in a general way before seems to me to be irrelevant given, first of all, the history of at least one party being very willing to borrow substantially from the Treasury, and secondly, a little bit like the debt ceiling crisis. When we hit that point and one party says, you know, we can smooth this out and work it out, and the other party says, no, we've got to solve the whole thing right away, I don't think that happens. So I think borrowing from the Treasury is very likely to happen. Now I want to jump up to the two most recent plans vetted by the Office of the Actuary that did achieve not just solvency, but sustainable solvency. Sam Johnson is the head of the Social Security Subcommittee. John Larson is the ranking minority member. And no surprise, there's very little overlap in their proposals. So there's the revenue side. There's the benefit side. The signs are consistently different. Two things where they get the signs the same, adjusting the taxation of benefits. And secondly, both want to do something more for the most vulnerable. One of the places they split, and one of the things that caught my attention, was going different directions on the cost of living adjustment. And you notice here that Johnson also had an increase in benefits for people who had been on the rolls for 20 years. To my mind, as a way of saying that somehow continuing this at a reduced rate was not a good idea. And the Simpson-Bowles Commission also went this way and also had a change like that. And the Boskin Commission, which talked about the biases in the CPI, led some people to propose CPI minus a number to adjust for the biases. So I decided this was something I'd be interested in reading about, and that's what I turned to read. The National Academies appointed a very blue ribbon commission to look into the CPI, and it was really informative to be browsing in the book. It was too many hundred pages for a slow reader like me. And this, I think, is the important thing, that you have a public policy purpose in your automatic adjusting, and you've got to ask the question, how well does any one of the CPI measures help with meeting that public purpose? That, it seems to me, is the central issue. And the first thing that struck me was to say, what is the public purpose in this? In the legislation, the 72 legislation, Congress said cost of living increase to reflect the CPI, the only CPI we had at the time. But is that what we really want, given that it's measured the way it is? And I'll get back to that in a moment. So the first thing to ask is, we'll say you're a retiree, we'll say you got an array of alternative indexing mechanisms. Assume they're all constrained for the same expected PDV. What would you want? And what struck me is when we think about the accumulation phase, there is enormous literature on asset portfolio you should choose, how you change it with your risk aversion, how you change it as you age, how you change it for other risks you're subject to. And I thought, have I ever seen any discussion like that for choice of annuity after retirement? And I hadn't. So I emailed a distinguished colleague and said, anyone write about this? And the answer came back, no. So here's an item for research. How do we lay out, we go back to the Yari piece, which had a very simple structure, and you wanted a real annuity in that very simple structure, and you wanted to annuitize 100% of your wealth. In that setting, we know that doesn't happen. We know people have a lot of trouble buying annuities, evaluating annuities. So this, it seems to me, is an important question. And then the second thing that is widely recognized is this concern about the relationship between how well off retirees are and how well off workers are, both contemporaneous workers and themselves when they were workers earlier, replacement rate concepts. And of course, you've got to pay attention to what you've got in the way of resources, but of course, you've got a trade-off between initial benefits and the cost of the way you're adjusting them over time. So this, I think, is an important research question. So what are the shortcomings of a cost of living index? What is the cost of living index trying to do? Well, first of all, for a single agent, assuming you have exactly the same indifference curves in year 1 and year 2, then you ask, given a change in prices, what change in income lands you on that same indifference curve? Problems with that? Preferences change with aging. Let me assure you of that. Secondly, preferences change with consumption history. You learn what you like. You learn to like it more if you get better at it. And preferences change with the consumptions of others. Prime example, think about bestsellers. Partially, you're interested in reading them because other people are reading them. And the second thing to recognize is these changes compound for a long time for some of the retirees. So all of these, to my mind, suggests that we do not want a cost of living index because it's not, it may be an approximation of some things we're interested in. Obviously, if we got the classic inflation that didn't change any relative prices, we know what we'd like to do in response to that. But that's not what we ever get. The second thing is the CPI is based on a representative consumer being the average consumption for the entire economy. But consumption patterns vary greatly in the population. And thirdly, medical costs reflect both changes in health and a commodity that is a special social concern. So to take an example, commonly referred to, compare healthcare today at today's prices with that of pick any earlier year you want for it. Which would you rather have, and doesn't that imply that the price index hasn't done enough for quality improvements? The counter-argument is, do we really want to say, if you're going to live longer, we're going to give you less per year to spend on everything other than medical care? Again, it's an issue we want to think about in a more complex way. And products change and enter and exit the market, making some comparisons difficult. The one example I picked out, this is Canadian. I think it's the same in the US. The Canadians, not surprisingly, had a very clear document explaining mostly what I was interested in learning about CPI rules with quality change. And I went to the BLS website, and let's just say it wasn't quite as straightforward as the Canadian presentation. So 1 year you have an automobile and it's got an add-on, and there's a price for the add-on. And the next year that add-on has become part of the standard package. So what do? They add the price of the add-on to the price of the car in the previous year, which you compare to the price with the add-on standard package in the later year. But it was an add-on because lots of people didn't want it. So now you're doing a quality adjustment in the eyes of some people, but not others. The underlying principle making no sense, I think, comes out if you think what they do about bestsellers. And the answer is they look at the average price of bestsellers one year, the average price of bestsellers the next year. Makes perfect sense because you're reading them out of a context where it's no longer a new book, it's no longer being read by so many people. It seems to capture exactly the right sense of where you are on your difference curve. But what does the principle say? The principle says, well, let's think of each book separately. So last year's bestsellers are now this year's remainders. Huge drop in prices. This year's bestsellers would have been priced under the principles that you see in this large literature. At what price would demand have been zero last year? Again, a big drop in prices. So if you were just applying the underlying principles, you'd get a nonsensical answer. And I think while this is something resembling the role of fashion rather than quality, I think there's a fair amount that does involve technological change that also has that flavor. You want to be playing the latest video games that your friends are playing, and it requires a new machine to do it. Well, you buy a new machine, and the new machine's going to be better than the old machine. But is that the primary reason you're buying it, or is it for access to the new video game? So I think there are a whole lot of problems. And the other issue, which is brought out in the National Academy volume, is the price data comes from retail stores and not directly from households. And so it's impossible with the existing process to satisfactorily examine two major aggregation issues, differences across different groups, and what they have labeled a democratic index, which would be some way of averaging over individuals what kind of adjustment they would need given looking the indifference curves, and what they called a plutocratic one, which is looking at total consumption, so it's weighting the people who spend more heavily in the index. We know we have an experimental index for the elderly, and that's done by doing a modification of the data being collected for the existing one. And we know the push the other way is chained, which makes more focus on the substitution effects going to be there. And that's how we've gotten to the two proposals, one basically to lower the cost of living adjustment, and the other to raise it. I think the debate, which of these is a better measure, the one that's technically correct for what a cost of living index is trying to do, or the one that's targeted on the audience we're interested in, that seems to me to be a useless debate. It's a useless debate because we haven't started with the question that I'm hoping the researchers will have worked out by next year's meeting, which is what do we want to be doing with these annual adjustments? Do we really want to be following a cost of living increase principle the way it's laid out? And rather than saying, can we approximate it better this way or that way, we should be asking what is it we want to approximate. So there are biases. I was familiar, of course, with the Boskin Commission and the push for recognizing that quality adjustments they estimated were larger than the CPI, the BLS used in the CPI. Browsing in the literature that I got connected to, there was an element that I hadn't seen before. Products have a normal pricing sequence. And when you switch from one that drops out to the closest approximate, that's a new product, because the prices tend to go down in the life cycle, you get an increase in inflation coming just out of that life cycle effect. And this paper recommended to me, I haven't actually read it other than the abstract, said there's a big effect here that the CPI is biased from that way of collecting data. So I think we don't want to get lost in the details there. So what do other countries do? I know in the US, particularly for the courts, but other places as well, there are people who think you shouldn't be looking at what anybody else does, but I do. So Canada and France, same kind of method. We have CPI adjustment. Finland, a mix of earnings changes and price changes, 2080. They also do indexing that we do on a wage index out of the reverse 80-20 mix. So they're recognizing something different in there. And of course, if you're talking about earnings changes, you would be seeing something very different in the US if you were looking at a mean or looking at a median. And you want to think, what is it you're trying to capture? Italy has a progressive indexing in the sense that they're different sizes for different income levels. Norway just knocks 0.75% off the wage growth as some measure of how much they want to leave out, something between, you would expect they would have thought real wages would grow more than at that rate. So I don't think it's targeted on the price index, but I haven't tracked that down. Switzerland does 50-50. But there's something more, which is a number of countries have now been recognizing that as the pension system deals with the large risks coming from demography and economics, some of that may appropriately be dealt with through the benefit level. Some of risk sharing doesn't necessarily have to be totally away from the retirees. And with the move from defined benefit to defined contribution systems, and the countries that are trying to resist that by trying to preserve what's sometimes called collective defined contribution, that is fully funded, but you don't have a sponsor taking on the risk. How do you divide it up among the workers and the retirees? There's a lot of attention being paid to rules, and it's still in the early research stages. So Sweden has a balance mechanism. It does a calculation of assets and liabilities, and if it gets bad enough, benefits don't grow as much. Germany has in its benefit formula something for whether contributions have gone up and what's happening in demography. Spain has something I couldn't figure out, but I thought it was interesting. There was something there. So now I want to jump back to the advisory council and that third group, further study of a plan to invest a portion of the trust fund in stocks indexed to the broad market. And those of you who are in the category that Courtney Coyle mentioned of reading everything coming out of Elise's shop knows they've been analyzing putting part of the trust fund into stocks. It's interesting, individual accounts, every individual account proposal is based around the idea people want stocks and will be buying some. But when we're doing it for everybody, no stocks. So it seems to me this is an interesting idea. And there is actually quite a sizable literature with OLG models in a sometimes just theoretical framework, sometimes in simulations, that makes the point that if you have a defined benefit system, that you're optimizing. All of these things are optimal plans. That's part of the limitation. Because you can spread risk out into future generations, you can take on more stock, you can do better. These measures are what safe rate of return gives you the same expected utility after 40 years of accumulation of a given amount. And as you see, it can make a big difference. An example of a large literature. Canada has an investment board investing in things all around the world. Their target is to cover 20 to 25% of benefits, the rest being the pay-as-you-go portion. Each 3 years, the chief actuary comes out with a report. Steve, wouldn't you love it, only having to do it every 3rd year? If the actuary reports there's a problem, there's a chance for legislation. If there isn't, certain things kick in semi-automatically. The actuary, I think, has to do something to trigger it. It might be blocked. So this gets to the issue, if you have stocks or if you're concerned about demography, how do you want those to play out in the experience of the already retired? Next to last slide. Surprised?
I'm really surprised.
So is the last minute inevitable? I fear the answer is yes. Obviously, if we could get to it sooner, every analyst says you've got more scope to do better. But of course, the scope to do better, you think, will only be better if the political powers that be have views that line up with your own views. Given how hard it's been so far, I think it's going to be very hard to see that happen. Does that favor tax increases relative to benefit cuts? I think the answer is no, because I think if we get to that point, borrowing seems to me to be inevitable. Is the last minute okay? Hey, it worked in '83. Well, the circumstances are a lot worse, but I don't know that we have an alternative. Form a commission, as I've already said. We want a commission that will help with the process. And to this end, and actually I was wrong, I've got one more. This commission was charged with a 50-50 balance, and it was a distinguished commission made up of very knowledgeable people. They came up with a package. 50-50 is a number. I would like to see the political process focused on, we're going to appoint a commission and we're going to give it a charge, and it's going to be a balanced charge. It's not necessarily between 0 and 1. And we want to have a political process, preferably that engages the voters, because this is a fairly crisp issue, on what Congress should vote, given that the commission is inevitable, what Congress should vote for the charge for that commission. That's my political hope for the future. The last word goes to FDR, who had the first word. This is a photograph from the FDR Memorial here in Washington, and I hand you back 24 seconds.
Thank you. Thank you. Pete, will you be willing to take a few questions?
I guess so.
So, how about this side? No questions? Jeff? Okay.
Peter, I guess one question I have about if the COLA were reduced in some way, do you worry at all about what that does to kind of the people's benefits as they kind of get older? I mean, how do you think of the COLA as a way to ensure that the benefit doesn't shrink with age as people kind of get further and further from the time they claim Social Security? Just wondering about that.
Oh, I think we absolutely need some adjustment, and I think under the... It's a little bit blinding here. And unless we go into severe deflation, I mean, it's standard to say you get an increase with inflation and you don't get a decrease with deflation. I don't know quite where that logic comes from. except if you think if we're in a deflation, the economy's a mess, and the last thing you want to do from a fiscal point of view is cut benefits. But there's no question you want some adjustment for inflation. There's no question you'd like to do something to adjust for financial differences across ages, to adjust for the kind of experience. It would be great to have some research on the consumption patterns along aging. Probably it exists. I didn't go searching for it.
Consumption data isn't great.
But if we're going to address the question I posed, which is what do we want to accomplish with that, it seems to me we've got to look at what people do through the aging process and recognize, as those two proposals did, that something that might make sense with a 1 or 2 year horizon may not make sense with a 20-year horizon.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's
Identify yourself.
Sure. Hi, my name is Brian Collins. Thanks for your talk, and the thoughts on the COLA and CPI struck me as very interesting, and I hadn't really realized that chain CPI and CPIE were really taking an existing structure and modifying it. And so if we were to start over again in terms of building up how we measure a COLA, now in our modern world where a lot of payments are electronic through credit and debit cards, I mean, from your perspective, where would you start and what might be a better base to build on if we were to, over the long term, replace the existing CPI with a totally new measure of prices?
Okay, yes, people are very aware that we've got this astonishing flow of data now, and people are starting to work at it. There are two things here. One is we want to connect it with the people making the purchases, and we want to get prices in a reliable way. So just surveys of people won't give you reliable prices. And just surveys of stores won't give you who the people are. Electronically, you may be able to be doing both of those if it isn't an excessive violation of privacy. And then you could do things with it. What you do with it in an age when you can get software to do a lot of different things, you want to ask the questions, what uses are being made for it? So you might want a different CPI for retirement benefits than for a union employer negotiated contract with adjustments over a 3-year wage horizon. You might want something different for the Fed. Which measure of prices is going to be most informative of the inflation risk they're worried about? We know they already take out things that are too volatile for limited predictability. Maybe there are more sophisticated ways. I think before we go to that, we need more research on what it is we want to do with it with different public purposes.
Hello. Jeff Brown, University of Illinois and NBER. Peter, one of the things that you said early on, which I agree with, is it would be, we need to give some thought to the issue around what holding sort of the present discounted value of benefits fixed. What type of payout path would consumers choose? And I guess my question for you is, as you think about this, do we want the answer to that question assuming that we've got rational optimizing agents, or that we have consumers that behave as they do with financial literacy, behavioral biases, and so forth that might lead them to make decisions that, according to our models at least, are not optimal for them? So it's a question of how much paternalism do we want in answering that question?
Well, there are two separate issues here. One is we're trying to measure how they will spend what they're spending and what we think are the implications of that. And I think there you take their behavior as you find it, because we're not going to be changing that. The second issue is what do we do to the extent that we give people choice over the two dimensions? Do we have, as we have now, a benefit that's 100% an annuity benefit, although joint life in some circumstances? Or do we do what many DC systems do and give people a choice within limits of how much to annuitize? that's a place where the question of how paternalistic you want to be comes in. And then the second one is, if we have alternative ways of designing it, do we, as we do right now, pick one, and it's the same for everybody, or do we give people some choice? So in Sweden, with the premium pension, it's required, that's just a small piece of the mandatory pension system, it's required that they annuitize, but they've got some choice on single life, joint life, basically. It's by transferring. They have some choice on timing, and they have two alternative choices of what kind of annuity. Chile has an electronic system you've got to go through to try to get informed, because it's a competitive market providing the annuities, and this is a complex instrument, hard to compare, so they try to lead people by the hand through it. The Financial Conduct Commission in the UK has found that the annuitization that happens there used to be some that was required, that's just gone away. A large fraction of people get their annuity from the firm that had been handling their accumulation, and a large fraction of those pay more than they would have paid for the same annuity from somebody else. So you can deal with process, you can deal with how much choice do you allow, you can deal with whether you allow any choice at all, and I think these are all basic to the mindset of the country of how you choose. There's no reason to think there's a single right answer for everywhere around the globe.
So Teresa, we'll finish up with you.
Thanks. It's quick. Teresa Ghilarducci at the New School. Can you revisit the idea of the individual accounts, the publicly held individual accounts, and what the debate was about then and how you feel about them now?
Another hour, Alicia? There are advantages and disadvantages with individual account accumulation. And again, the pattern depends on how you do it. Hong Kong recently put in a mandatory DC system and just turned everybody loose in the financial market. It's an unbelievable mess. Australia has a very expensive system because they don't have any centralization, multiple accounts per people. A lot of the costs are a cost per account. Chile and Sweden, you only have one account because they regulate it down to that. In Sweden, the centralization has taken over a lot of it, but they have this weird idea that more choice is better in the portfolio. So they had, last time I looked, 800 different mutual funds. And what happens is that a lot of people, including some economists I've talked to, just go with the default if you don't choose, because that's well designed. So you could have no choice, but still an individually targeted individual account, because you're doing it out of age-related rules, and you're doing the low-cost investment, and you're accumulating different amounts given computers in different people's accounts. The kinds of questions you want to ask is, first of all, how much funding do you want in the system? You saw the Canadian answer. I think 100% would be no place to try to go. I think the transition of going from limited funding to much more funding is something that what we've seen is a huge number of countries imitated Chile, and then a significant fraction of those then backtracked because the fiscal dimension of it. So this is where there are a whole bunch of questions you have to answer, and then they connect to the question, what are you doing about risks generally? The US system, if I can take my prediction and view it as a description of the system, is every now and then when we have to, we'll revisit. That's a rotten way to spread risks across cohorts. So if you're going to get away from that, you're going to have a whole lot of automatic adjustments, and you still want to revisit from time to time because social circumstances change, and researcher knowledge and understanding changes. A lot of the early terrible steps, I think, were things where it just hadn't been researched very deeply. And this is globally. I'm not narrowly US focused on this. So I have no inherent objection to individual accounts being part of a system. I have no inherent objection to their not being there. My sense is if we're running a system without individual accounts, the centralized investment should include a diversified portfolio, as the Canadians do, as the Norwegians do, as sovereign wealth funds do. Not as a giant hedge fund by the federal government, but as a way of saying this is a risk-return trade-off that looks attractive in a world where half the American workforce holds no stocks. And the issue of how you want to spread risks around between workers and retirees depends on what sorts of things are happening. So basically, I'm giving you a very long-winded, I refuse to answer.
On that note, Peter, let's thank Peter. Thank you so much.